Man accidentally uncovers trapdoor attic with a treasure trove of antiques. Old properties often come with buckets of charm, but some are more special than others. David J. Whitcomb just happened to have purchased one of the better ones, as he was thrilled to discover in bizarre circumstances. The lawyer was taking a look around his new place when he stumbled across something odd. A secret room was sitting above his head, and inside lay some of the most fascinating treasures you could imagine. Whitcomb happened to be with a friend when he made his astonishing discovery. The pair were in the process of fitting a new light bulb on the building's third level when, while looking at the ceiling, they noticed that something seemed a little off. So the duo stacked some seats into a makeshift tower, and Whitcomb clambered up them. Up close, the owner realized he just found a trapdoor. Using the light from his cell phone, Whitcomb pushed open the door and took a peek inside. Right away, the property owner was greeted by the sight of a load of photographs in fancy picture frames, some of which appeared to be gold. He and his friend had uncovered a haul of treasure, though they didn't yet understand just how important these artifacts really were. Pretty soon after uncovering the haul, Whitcomb and his pal started to sort through all the photos and frames. And as they did so, it became increasingly clear that they'd found something special here. In one particular photograph, you see, a massively important historical figure was staring back at them. But what was the full story? Why was there a photograph of such an important person from history hidden away in this secret attic? There were plenty of questions that needed to be answered, but that was surely an exciting prospect for the self-confessed antiques aficionado. Whitcomb would have to do some sleuthing. Of course, Whitcomb hadn't purchased this building in Geneva with the expectation of finding any treasure. The lawyer had acquired it for a far more prudent reason. His business was growing, and he needed the extra space. The attorney had no idea that such an endeavor would lead to such an incredible discovery. Whitcomb spoke to broadcaster CNN in February 2021 about the moment he first took a look through the trapdoor in the ceiling. He said, "The first thing I saw was a whole bunch of picture frames stacked together, and these frames are gorgeous. They're the turn of the century, they're gold, gilded, and they shone really bright, and I was like, oh my god. I lowered myself and said I think we just found the Goonies treasure." Amazed by what they'd found, Whitcomb and his pal waited until the following day to properly investigate their haul. They wanted to give it the time it deserved, presumably. In the end, they put in some 12 hours of work to try and sort through all the artifacts in the newly uncovered attic room. Everything the pair found up in that attic seemed related to photography in some way. The place was full of pictures and glass negatives, not to mention all the frames and other snappers' gear. They also found several letters and documents up there, which seemed to confirm that these items had once belonged to one James Hale. Intrigued, Whitcomb decided to reach out for help. He tracked down a photographer in the local area who agreed to attempt to develop photos from the glass negatives found in the attic. Plus, Whitcomb made contact with the Geneva Historical Society to see if any of its members could shed light on his discovery. As luck would have it, the president of the society was once a man named Dan Weinstock who, it transpired, had investigated Hale. According to Weinstock, the photographer had been quite successful in his day. His images had brought him acclaim and prizes, and in 1885 he'd even taken a portrait of Frances Folsom, the then fiancée and future wife of President Grover Cleveland. Weinstock told the lawyer that Hale had lived in Geneva, New York, between the years of 1892 and 1920. At that point, though, he'd decided to make a change and move on. So, he put his business up on the market, where it had been snapped up by a fellow photographer. Weinstock was aware that Hale had operated a studio on the second level of Whitcomb's building. He'd had no idea, though, that the photographer had left a load of his equipment in the attic above. In fact, the people who'd owned the place before Whitcomb had been none the wiser, either. At some point in the building's long history, renovations had been carried out. These ultimately ended up hiding the space with all the photography gear inside from view. A drop ceiling had been installed, which had meant that the attic's entrance was totally out of sight. For so many decades, then, nobody knew anything at all about this storage space. Speaking to CNN, Whitcomb reflected on the secret room, admitting that its story may always remain something of an enigma. He said, "We don't know how it ended up where it did and why it was just left and sealed off. We'll probably never know the answer to that, but a little mystery is a good thing, I guess." Whitcomb planned to keep the attic accessible from the floor below once it had been cleared out. Given the sheer number of things inside, though, that in itself wasn't going to be an easy task. Realizing he needed some help, the lawyer sought help from an auctioneer in the area to catalog everything. That expert, One Source Auctions owner Aaron Curvin, also spoke to CNN about the haul. What had struck him was just how happy Whitcomb had seemed in the wake of his discovery. He remembered, Whitcomb was all excited, like a kid in a candy store. He couldn't believe it, he was like a little mini treasure hunter. Curvin had clearly found the haul itself fascinating. As he put it, it's like stepping back in time finding this guy's studio from 100 years ago or more. For a person who deals with old treasured artifacts, random finds such as the contents of this room must represent something close to a dream come true. But what exactly was it that made this room and its contents so special? Well, the photographs themselves were the most exciting items. Even at a glance, one can appreciate them as valuable contemporary records of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Many contained images of women dressed in the fashion of their era, while other pictures showed sports teams. In short, they represented snapshots of history. In truth, though, some of the photographs were more noteworthy than others. During his lifetime, you see, the photographer Hale had forged links with some members of a very important group of the era. That is, he knew and took photographs of several women involved in the early American suffragist movement. There can sometimes be some confusion between the suffragists or suffragettes, as the terms don't quite denote the same thing. Both battled for the rights of women in society, though the suffragists emerged as a movement first. Broadly speaking, the suffragists sought to make societal changes through peaceful means. In contrast, the suffragettes were more aggressive in their attempts to achieve equality between the sexes. Frustrated by what they viewed as the small gains made by the suffragettes emerged to bring things forward more dramatically. These activists were set on taking a more hard-headed approach than their predecessors. Contemporary society owes much to the activists who fought for women's rights across the 19th and 20th centuries. So, when Whitcomb discovered that the photographs he'd found in his property showed many of the leading lights of the women's movement, he was understandably exhilarated. Portraits of significant figures such as Elizabeth Smith Miller and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had been stowed away in the attic room. Perhaps the most exciting discovery of all, though, was a big portrait of Susan B. Anthony. Anthony had been one of the key figures of the women's movement, and she had earned a reputation for lobbying for things like working rights. She was an important leader, which made her portrait all the more precious. And on top of everything else, it turns out that Hale had snapped the picture in 1905, just a year before the suffragist's death. Anthony had been born in Massachusetts in 1820, the child of a farmer and cotton mill operator. Her family were Quakers, which really had a bearing on the politics she took up in her adult life. The Quakers believed that every single person is equal in the eyes of God, so it's easy to see how such a belief would nourish her feminism. When she grew up, Anthony came to support the movement to end slavery in the United States. Inspired by figures such as Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, Anthony became an activist herself. At the time, of course, it was widely deemed inappropriate for a woman to speak out publicly in this way. In 1848, a pivotal event took place in Seneca Falls in New York that essentially kick-started the movement for women's suffrage. While Anthony wasn't in attendance herself, all the same she became a supporter of the cause. In 1851 she was introduced to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whom she befriended and joined in speaking out about women's rights. Anthony and Cady developed a certain degree of fame because of their activism and commitment to the cause of equality. They spoke widely throughout America, plus they jointly edited a newspaper called The Revolution. Their work ultimately split the public, with some admiring and supporting them, while others tended to regard them with disdain. When the U.S. Congress enshrined the voting rights of black men into law with the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, Anthony and Stanton were left fuming. Women had been totally ignored by the legislation, and the campaigning duo decided not to support it. It was a controversial stance, and one that led to a split in the suffragist movement. In 1872 Anthony was taken into police custody for placing a vote in an election. She received a fine for her act, which ultimately captured people's attention and brought the suffrage movement into sharper public focus. She later led others in a protest during America's centennial celebrations, where she spoke passionately alongside other prominent suffragists. Anthony dedicated her life to the cause of women's equality. She spoke loudly and eloquently about the need for equal voting rights, though she sadly never got to see this come to fruition. She passed away in 1906, 14 years short of the passing of the 19th Amendment, which finally gave women the vote. Anthony's legacy, then, is utterly profound when it comes to the nature of contemporary life in America. Without the efforts of her and her allies, women might yet remain second-class citizens within their own nation. With all that in mind, it's easy to see why the discovery of her portrait in Whitcomb's property has caused such a stir. The portrait of Anthony itself is actually quite well known. In fact, Hale had handed over the rights to the image to the Susan B. Anthony Memorial Association, which then used it as the official depiction of the suffragist herself. A copy of the photo is even held in the Library of Congress. Excitingly, Whitcomb actually found the glass negative that was used in the printing of this famous photograph. That's quite the artifact, but unfortunately it's broken and Anthony's head isn't a part of it. Whitcomb remains hopeful that he'll be able to find the rest of the negative, but only time will tell. In the end, Whitcomb handed over responsibility for the collection in his attic over to Curvin's auction firm. Under the care of professionals, the pieces will be conserved and eventually sold. And while Whitcomb has decided to retain a few favorite items, the sale of everything else should net him a tidy little payday. And that's no exaggeration. According to projections made after the discovery, the photos of Anthony alone were expected to fetch anywhere from $10,000 up to a whopping $50,000. And in total the worth of the entire haul has been estimated at a potential $100,000. Ultimately, though, the unique nature of the collection means that its true worth is hard to predict. And Whitcomb pointed that out during an August 2021 chat with the newspaper Rochester Democrat and Chronicle. He said, "It's very difficult to gauge the value of this collection, only because there's simply nothing else like it." Whitcomb went on, as one expert in photography from Eastman Kodak put it, "It's like opening a tomb in Egypt that hasn't been previously opened and raided." In the photography field, it's opening a time capsule to the height of photography, before everyone had a handheld camera and instant photos. Deborah L. Hughes serves as the head of the National Susan B. Anthony Museum and House, so she obviously has a tremendous interest in this story. She even has a copy of the print that came from the negative discovered in Whitcomb's attic. Anything that can tell her more about who Anthony was is clearly an exciting prospect for her. When Hughes spoke to CNN about the collection discovered by Whitcomb, she was unable to hide her delight. As she put it, "When I think about this negative and the broken glass, it's a little bit reminiscent of some of the glass ceilings that Susan B. Anthony set in place for us to keep breaking."